on the depth of the scratch are conservative assumptions on the different inputs into the equation. And I reviewed the paper that was produced, and there is an engineering judgment. There's a few places where numbers have to be chosen with some engineering foresight, and the numbers were chosen conservatively, which is different than engineering judgment, choosing a conservative number. And so using the inputs that were chosen conservatively, the maximum depth of the scratch with the 2% transverse load is about 10,000ths of an inch. I'll compare that. That's about as thick as 2 to 3 sheets of paper, and I'll compare that for the layman to the acceptance criteria, which is a 1/16 of an inch or 62 thousandths. So the acceptance criteria for the manufacturing procedure and bounded by the ASME code is 6 times the maximum depth that we calculated in the paper. I don't recall the width of it. I'll have to get back to you on the width, but the length of it could be the full length of the canister.
Okay. And again, this is Janine, and just given the scratch analysis, and maybe this is for someone else on the panel, I mean, what is precluding Southern California Edison from actually examining the worst case canister that's out on the pad currently?
Yeah, this is Tom Palmisano. As I said, this would be an input and a consideration in the inspection maintenance program we've committed to. I think you're all familiar, the NRC's age management program is required at the 20-year point as part of the license renewal. For the whole tech system, we've committed to an inspection maintenance program much earlier. This will be one of the inputs we consider. We see no need for any immediate inspection. We think it's more appropriate to factor this into the upcoming inspection maintenance program.
This is Doug Bauer. I also want to emphasize that in a prior statement we made, I indicated that we would be inspecting, I want to choose my words carefully here, we would be inspecting on or before November of 2020. In fact, our requirements are to have the program developed and ready in place prior to November of 2020. So it's not a big difference, but it's something we indicated earlier.
I had a question. I want to take you to slide 24. If we could pull that up. Basically, this is a statement of your root cause evaluation, or your root cause for the first of the 2 apparent violations. And management failed to recognize the complexity and risks associated with the long-duration fuel transfer campaign while using a relatively new system design. So I think what I would like to focus on, and really my question is, it was granted a relatively new system design, right? The UMAX system, and obviously your employment of that is new to you, certainly. So my question is, if consistent with your root cause statement, if it's true that its management failed to recognize the complexity and risks associated with using a relatively new system design, my question is why? I mean, it's a simple question, but I'm trying to understand what, if you have a new design and well, I don't want to go too much further than that, because I don't want to sound overly pejorative. I'm just trying to understand, how is it you accept that as a root cause? That's my question.
Yes, this is Jim Peake. The root cause of corrective action for that goes back to the whole tech design procedure, the design review procedure. And it really, the corrective action is associated with having a second independent team looking at it from a site support services execution side of the design, more so than the engineering technical design itself. So in the case of the shield ring was designed, but that design wasn't reviewed or challenged by personnel that had to go then execute work utilizing that new design. So their corrective action are associated with changing their design review process.
Okay, I think I understand, but, okay, so let me try to repeat back, so make sure I get your answer clear. So the shield ring, the addition of the shield ring inside the vault was also new. It was an addition based on some reasoning it was applied, presumably for dose reduction. But that introduced additional challenges associated with tolerance, clearances, and downloading. And so what are you saying, that management failed to recognize that the addition of that shield ring introduced additional complexities associated with the downloading operations and all the manifestations of those complexities in terms of training and procedures and everything else? Is that what you're saying? I'm just trying to be clear.
Yes, this is Jim Beatty. So the answer is yes, that's exactly what we're trying to say.
Yeah. Scott, this is Compound Sound. Let me add, the additional shield ring is one factor. It's certainly feasible to download a canister successfully with the shield ring with the appropriate guidance. The real issue in looking at some of this, in looking at the extent of a 73 canister campaign and the turnover of people that is to occur. I think Jim, in his earlier comments, laid out that when you're doing a 5 to 10 canister campaign, you typically have 1 or 2 experienced crews that stay together through the course of the campaign. But we fail to really appreciate the inevitable turnover of people and maybe the change in experience. And that's where the quality of the procedures and the training and the supervision became apparent that we had underestimated the complexity from that standpoint.
So I'm going to play that back just again so I understand it. So the presumption is that the training, the procedures, the oversight was all adequate before, assuming that it was a short duration campaign.
And assuming there was a certain, say, prior experience level. And that,
and so the root cause statement, I'm sorry to cut you off, Tony.
No, and when you've got a small group of people for a short campaign, you don't have the turnover, your lessons learned are much easier to deal with. They've experienced, they've learned the lessons. As you turn over people in the longer campaign, that's where some of the weaknesses contributed to the event.
So, okay, so thank you for that. So the root cause then is management failed to recognize that because of what you just said, because it was a long duration evolution, and because of that, there is turnover, changing of the guard, so to speak, experience that you might have had at the beginning was no longer there because of turnover, attrition, whatever. And their management didn't recognize that loss of experience, knowledge, skill, what have you, then that ultimately was why the quote-unquote inadequate training, inadequate procedures revealed themselves.
Yes, exactly. Weak procedures and training that may have been adequate for the short campaign were not adequate for the longer campaign.
Did you have a follow-up on that, Linda?
That's a perfect segue. This is Linda again. You provide us with a lot of corrective actions here. I know it's not all-encompassing, but the benefit of the audience and to get you on the record, since this is an important element. For both of the apparent violations, you've identified management oversight as an issue. And there's not a lot of specific corrective actions in your presentation that are directly related to that element. And it is related to what Scott was just asking you about. So bottom line question is, can you just review for us the corrective actions that directly relate to management oversight? Because this is not a whole tech activity. This is a Southern California Edison activity. So it's not sufficient to just say, we didn't recognize that they weren't minding the store. It's all of you sitting at the table minding the store. And then if you've added anything into the corrective action program now that you're using that maybe a little more aggressively, or will be in the future, that also would capture management oversight gaps or issues. And
only whoever on the panel thinks that you're the appropriate person to answer.
So I'd like to start by just explaining that I am the new general manager for decommissioning oversight. I am an SC employee. I've been an SC employee for 37 years. My experience is been in maintenance, and I've actually been a refueling supervisor for 13, 14 outages. In fact, I was the manager in charge of safely refueling both units after we announced the shutdown. Also utilizing essentially a small crew of experienced personnel. So, I take this issue very seriously. As far as other changes, I've actually changed my organization such that I go back to the model that works for me, which is oversight is intrusive, right? That the personnel that I put to go oversee the contractor are in fact in the field providing guidance to the contractor, validating that the contractor is in fact following their procedures step by step, doing their pre-job briefs such that personnel are properly instructed before they go out in the field. In fact, we're doing what we've committed to go do by our procedures. That is a full-time responsibility that I've assigned to my oversight people. That is a separate oversight function than how it was being performed previously, which more of a surveillance activity where you would plan and then go monitor and then basically document what you're observing. So I think that's the primary thing. In my CAP experience, the new senior management observation process where all observations now have to be entered in the corrective action program also helps us ensure that management is doing observations at the level that senior management would expect, right? And that screening committee should be challenging those observations with regard to their depth, right? Are these management observations adding value? Are they looking at the right things, right? And then I'll be reporting directly to Doug with regard to what we're seeing within the senior management observation program also.
Thank you, Jim. This is Doug Bauer. I'd like to emphasize a couple of points. First, although the number of corrective actions around oversight are not as great as in other areas, the impact is pretty high. Some of the key ones Jim discussed, changes in roles and responsibilities, holding his organization accountable. These oversight specialists, some were let go, additional skilled people were brought in, and their expectations to directly coach in the field, not just sit back and write an observation sheet. Further, what I've asked for is a management program for us that includes me to be out in the field in teams on a structured basis. So Lou Bosch has put that together. We had our first team in the field last week. I think that's correct, right, Lou? That's correct. And on Tuesday, I spent 3.5 hours observing a training download evolution, as we indicated, and I had 6 or 8 comments that Jim is working through the process to put in place. So I completely understand the perspective here. Edison owns this. This is not a contractor issue. It's our oversight responsibility. We take it serious. I will tell you that from my perspective, if the right oversight had been in place on August the 3rd, prior to that, the other aspects of shortfalls that have been talked about here, procedures, training, they would have been identified. And we wouldn't just have been relying on skill of the craft, as Tom indicated. So when we talk about oversight, maybe the number of actions isn't as great, but the impact is great.
So thank you for that. The reason we're boring in on this issue is because this is central to your root cause, right? So if your root cause is about oversight, the failure to recognize, that's why we're trying to draw out, more precisely what specific actions were taken to address that failure to recognize. Did you have a follow-up?
This is Eric Simpson. I had a question. This is sort of an inspection item that we'll be finding out, but your oversight specialists, are they going to be in the field for each and every evolution, or only the most critical task, or will they be in the field observing every task 24/7, both units?
Eric, this is Jim P. So to answer your question, the procedures actually require their presence in the field for medium and high-risk activities, especially those activities that have already been predefined for lifting. So that is a requirement by procedure. Other activities that are of low risk would not be a procedure requirement, but it is my expectation that as long as I have oversight personnel available, that they are out in the field, right, observing the work activities for that day.
Jim, this is Linda again. Could just for the benefit of the audience and the benefit of those of us on the NRC side who are participating, could you just give us a couple of examples of what a medium and high risk activity would be so that we kind of understand what the threshold is?
Yeah, so a high risk activity would be essentially activities that involve handling of fuel. So loading of a canister or movement of a canister with a new reg 0612 activity would be a high risk activity. Medium risk activity could be a heavy lift that's outside of the guidance of new reg 0612. So it may not be handling the fuel, but we would still look at that as it's a heavy load handling activity. It has risk, industrial safety risk. We would expect the same behaviors apply.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
I think we've reached the end of our questions. Was there any additional information, Doug, that you or your team wants to provide before we move to close?
I think one item is a follow-up to a question that Janine had regarding kind of the procedural flow path we would go through if we had an incident in the dry fuel storage area. So, Jim, if you don't mind stepping us through that, or Lou.
Yes, Janine. So I believe your question was, what action would we take if we found that there was MPC damage, right? The whole tech operating procedure 600, which is the abnormal operations procedure, has a section in it specific to damage. It does not say canister drop. It's essentially any damage to a canister. That procedure directs the supervisor in charge to place the equipment in a safe condition, to move personnel to a safe low-dose area, to immediately notify the shift manager and senior management, and then radiation protection technicians would survey the area for radiological conditions or changes. We would also then write an action request, enter that into our corrective action program with as much detailed information as the supervisor can provide regarding the actual condition, in which case that action request would then be evaluated and appropriate action taken, work planned, and approved before we proceed with any recovery item.
Jim, thank you for that. Again, it's Janine. And just to follow on with that, one of the questions that underlies all that is what is considered MPC damage? So in this particular case, as he even has been noted on, like slide 16, where it talks about the ductile base plate locally conforming to the shape of the ring, essentially a dent in the canister, is that something that would cause you to enter into that procedure? What is considered MPC damage?
This is Jim, PD. So without having the procedure in front of me and understanding what the definition within the procedure was, I can't really answer that completely. But I would tell you that the day of the event, August 3rd, in fact, those actions were taken, although personnel may not have known whether or not the MPC had damage or a dent at the time. All right, so there was a action request generated, all right, to identify that event, which ultimately led our engineering group to assess it.
So Jim, I think this is probably one where we need to provide more information to the inspection team to follow up with that discussion. Just to add to what Jim said, once our shift manager is notified, he assesses the overall condition and reviews our emergency plan for any entry criteria, and review the radiological conditions to ensure any actions needed on a broader basis are taken.
Thanks for elaborating on that, Tom. This is Linda again. That procedure, along with several of the other procedures identified in your presentation, even though Holtec may have authored them, I know they've gone through Southern California Edison review. Those will be the subject of our additional future near-term inspection activities, so just to put that on the record.
All right, can I get the NRC slide 13 up, please? So I'm going to go ahead and move to close the meeting. I'll note that, again, as we said at the outset, the NRC will consider all the information we obtained today in making our final enforcement decision, and of course we'll notify you by telephone and in writing, which will be publicly available when we're ready to announce our decision. We strive to make that decision within 45 days. It could be sooner. At the outside, I would say 45 days. So what comes next? We'll make a final determination as to whether or not apparent violations constitute actual violations and their severity levels consistent with our enforcement policy. This determination will be communicated to Southern California Edison and will be made public. As we've noted a couple of times, the NRC staff in Region 4 plans to conduct follow-up inspections to determine whether corrective actions are appropriate and adequate to prevent future recurrence of the issues. And in addition, the results of those follow-up inspections will be communicated to the public in the form of a public meeting or webinar prior to or concurrent with the release of the inspection report. As Linda mentioned earlier, a decision on whether or not Southern California Edison is ready to resume fuel loading operations will be made after our inspection efforts, which I believe we have planned here in the next couple of weeks. That decision will be shared with the public during the aforementioned public meeting and or webinar, as well as in writing on the public record. I'll remind everyone that the apparent violations discussed at this conference are subject to further review and may be revised prior to any resulting enforcement action, and that any statements or expressions of opinions made by NRC employees at this conference or the lack thereof are not intended to represent final agency positions. Slide 14. So the NRC is interested in feedback from all participants and observers on how it conducts these meetings and other meetings, and in particular interested in comments about this meeting today. We've provided written comment forms which are available in the back. We invite any person who has a comment to complete the form. Please leave the forms with the individuals in the back, or if you prefer, you can send them in via email or mail. Persons attending through the webinar can find the feedback form on our website. So with that, the business portion of this conference is closed. Thank you. Slide 15, please. All right. Now that the business portion of the conference is concluded, I'd like to offer any observers the opportunity to comment on the meeting or to ask the NRC staff present any questions they may have about the NRC and our enforcement process. Doug, you and your team are welcome to stay and observe, or you're also welcome to depart. It's your decision. You're not going to be asked to respond to any questions that we get. So throughout the meeting, though, we have collected comments and questions through the webinar application, and in the time remaining, we'll try to answer those questions with a priority on questions that relate directly to our enforcement process. All questions received via the webinar will be posted on our Spotlight page, on the NRC homepage, along with closed caption video and an audio transcript of today's meeting. That will take a couple of weeks, as Linda mentioned at the outset. So I'm going to hand this over to Ryan Alexander in the back. Where's Ryan? There's Ryan. There's Ryan. So Ryan, take it away.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. My name, again, is Ryan Alexander. I'm actually a member of the NRC Region 4 staff who's primarily involved with our operating reactors and doing inspections and oversight of those facilities, but I was asked to support today for the Q&A session. As Linda and then, of course, now Scott has also mentioned, our priority in this portion of the meeting is to address your questions related to the NRC's enforcement decision-making process. Now, most of those questions that have all been raised are all been from the webinar. Just for everybody's full disclosure, there are no members of the public that have arrived at this meeting and are with us today. So all the questions that we'll be presenting to the NRC staff came from the webinar stream, which myself and several members of the staff have been monitoring throughout the activities this afternoon. So first of all, I want to thank you all for pointing out some of the technical difficulties that we were having, at least early on, with microphones and volume on the systems. We hope we appropriately address those for you so that you continue to participate here as we went through this afternoon. The other thing is there were many questions that were asked. Most of them, I'll be honest, were very focused on some of the technical aspects, which ultimately either SCE addressed, at least as part of the Q&A session with the NRC throughout many of these questions. But as Scott mentioned, a full transcript of all the questions will be posted at some point in the future from this webinar. What we want to focus on with the NRC staff right now is to focus on those questions related to the enforcement and decision-making process. And so I'll go ahead and just pose those questions to staff, and Scott can take them or hand them off as necessary. One question from a member of the public, and these are in no particular order, is can the public challenge any NRC enforcement actions, and if so, how?
So really the only mechanism for the public to challenge an enforcement decision rendered by the NRC is through what we call you'll hear it referred to the 2206 process. It's actually part 2 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Tenancy of Part 2, Section 2.206. And that is basically a request by anyone to take some enforcement action against a licensee. It's not necessarily a challenge to a decision per se. It's another request to consider an alternate course of action. And that there's a very formal process by which that can be done.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Another question that we received was, and I think Scott may have just touched on this in your closing remarks, but just to clarify for the individual, what is the expected timeline for the NRC's enforcement actions on each of these apparent violations?
Yeah, so consistent with our own internal metrics and policies, and like I said, we strive to get a final enforcement decision in the public domain within 45 days.
Okay. Appreciate that. Moving on, a third question, a little more technical in nature in terms of the process, is how does the NRC consider the licensee's failure to identify the July 22nd precursor event in determining the violation, either significance or the severity level of the event?
I open that up to Linda or anyone.
This is Linda. The July 22nd incident, I don't want to use the term event, has already been discussed in the inspection report that documented the results of the special inspection and the other 2 apparent violations, and it has been handled in one of the lesser safety significant violations at severity level 4. Really had to do with entering information into the corrective action program. So that has been dispositioned.
Along those lines, there's something that came in when we were in caucus from the staff that also goes back to the special inspection. Is how did the NRC assess the licensee's implementation of the fitness for duty program for those individuals involved during the August 3rd event?
Eric or Janine?
Well, it's my understanding in our discussions with the licensee, they did perform a for-cause fitness for duty evaluation of those individuals involved in the event, and they both came back negative. They were not impaired during this evolution, so there was no fitness for duty impact to the individuals. There was no fitness for duty issue.
Okay. Thank you. Different line of question that came up was regarding what it means. Southern California Edison used the term self-revealed in terms of some of the events. Can the NRC describe what this means and how the NRC considers this in determination of the enforcement process?
Michael, do you want to take that?
I'll be happy to. Self-revealing is a term that we use when we're considering identification credit. That's identification of an event that was self-revealing. And so when we're looking at identification credit, we look at the licensee's actions in there. Were they self-monitoring, and that's how they found it? We look at the ease of discovery. Were there prior opportunities to have discovered it? That's the kind of thing we look at for the violations where we're considering identification.
So, but with respect specifically to self-revealing, it's an incident that occurs. It's nobody found it before it occurred. It found you.
Yeah.
It's a self-revealing event is, I'm trying to think of a good example.
Well, let me use the August 3rd example. To be, very obvious, the redundant safety systems were the slings that were connected to the vertical cast transport system. And it was very obvious that they were no longer supporting the load of the canister. So that is why I believe Southern California has characterizes that one as self-revealing.
Appreciate the clarification for the public. With that, we have actually one last question that had not been addressed either in Mike's preamble or in the enforcement process, and it had to do with the NRC's interactions with the U.S. Attorney General or the Department of Justice, and specifically in this case, where our findings turned over to the U.S. Attorney General and Department of Justice for criminal prosecution.
So the short answer to that question is no. I know that we've had conversations with members of the FBI. Maybe, Linda, you want to just comment on that?
Sure. In this particular case, the NRC has sole jurisdiction over taking a civil action. We have been in communication with the Bureau of Investigations. There has been no expressed interest, nor would they have the primary jurisdiction at this point in time. We have coordinated information with them.
With that, I'm going to look back to my cohorts in the back. Were there any other process and enforcement agency questions that come up just in the last few minutes while I've been up here that we can share? No. Okay. I'm getting a no on that. So with that, Scott, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, remarkably, we were able to get everything covered within the allotted 3-hour window, and I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the staff. I want to apologize again to those of you participating on the webinar for the technical challenges we experienced during this with respect to, I understand there's been some feedback and some difficulty hearing. This is this format for conducting these type of meetings is a relatively new innovation for us. It's not innovative by any stretch. But for us it is, and we haven't done too many of these, and I think this is actually only our second or third where we've conducted a public meeting like this via webinar, and so there's bound to be challenges. So again, I apologize for those challenges, and I look forward to any and all feedback we get about how we conducted this meeting. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you.